Good day, everybody, and welcome to another edition of the Military and Foreign Affairs Network. I am your host, the voice of reason. Today, we are continuing our ongoing coverage of the war between the Russian Federation and Ukraine. And today, I want to start off with some mainstream media headlines. And I want to read to you an article as being reported by Western media. And I want to talk about some other reports that are coming in from Western media as well, specifically the New York Times. And some of that information that is coming out, that is being reported by the New York Times, has the Ukrainian government very concerned. It is counter to the narrative that the Ukrainian state would like Western persons to hear. So here goes the first article. Ukrainian forces said they had penetrated the first line of Russian strongholds in the Zaporizhzhia region, in a sign that Kiev is edging closer to Moscow's sprawling network of fortified trenches along the southern front. Now, what they're talking about specifically is the success that Ukrainian forces have had near Robatna in this area here. Now, the sprawling network of Russian fortifications is this area, and it looks like the Ukrainians are keying on an advance route towards the town of Verbov. If we go back to the Rondelli Foundation map, now please keep in mind this map. For transparency's sake, my understanding is that this organization receives a lot of funding from the Open Societies Foundation, or has received funding from Open Societies. That's a concern for me. But be that as it may, we're going to still have a look at this map. So again, this is Verbov. Obviously, this does not show the fortification network that is in place. This is an older map, but nonetheless, you can see what the Ukrainians are trying to do. Again, a very narrow salient in which they are trying to break through this main Russian defensive line. This is the same area, just on a different map. If I convert to the satellite view on this map, it's just not of the same quality. The Ukrainian military claimed on Thursday that its units had advanced towards two villages to the south and east of Robatna, a village in Zaporizhzhia that Kiev secured last week amid grueling counteroffensive that is yielding incremental gains. And again, that's this area here. And we'll go back and look at the close-up map where you, the viewer, can see exactly what we're looking at. So again, this is that town of Robatna. I'm probably saying that wrong. I apologize. But what's a person from the Tidewater region of the United States supposed to do? Anyway, so again, a very small town. I don't even know if you could classify this as a town, but more of a village type of area. So again, not a resounding, overly optimistic accomplishment for the Ukrainian military. And again, in all likelihood, what do the Ukrainians currently set on? Well, they set on open fields with tree lines, small areas of foliage in between these areas. And compounding that, again, the Russians have an air force. They're using these glide bombs, attack helicopters to hit the Ukrainian military. And since I'm talking about that, that should segue into the report from the New York Times. Well, the New York Times is reporting that Ukrainian casualties exceed 70,000. And I assume that when they say casualties, they mean Ukrainian killed in action. That is probably an accurate figure. I know I'd mentioned probably on the low end about 50,000 Ukrainian service members killed. Got a lot of pushback about that with the Russian supporters that watch this channel. And some Russians believe that it is as high as 400,000. I do not believe that is the case. That is many times the strength of the Ukrainian army at the onset of the conflict. And the Ukrainian army right now probably possesses around 700 to 1 million active duty personnel that have been conscripted into service. So that 400,000 is a big number. 50,000 more reasonable. Now the New York Times is reporting 70,000. And the Ukrainians push back hard on that. And their rationale is that the Russians have suffered between 7 to 8 times more casualties than the Ukrainians. Well, I would say that early in the campaign, when the Russians were on the offensive, okay, it's possible that the Russian casualty levels were higher. Is it 3 to 1? Maybe. I don't know. But 7 to 8 sounds out there. But that's what the Ukrainians are pushing. They're trying to push that narrative of 7 to 8 casualties per each Ukrainian casualty, and that's a difficult number to buy in. And why is that? Well, specifically now, if the Ukrainians claim 7 to 8 casualties, well, the problem with that, the Ukrainians are quote unquote on the offensive. Okay, and they're in the offensive in an area in which, again, it's very open. This is like the fields of western Nebraska or Kansas. Okay, very wide open areas that allow for the Russians to use standoff weapon systems, be it a ground attack aircraft, cruise missiles, Iskander missiles, ballistic missiles, anti-tank guided weapon systems, attack helicopters. Okay, the Ukrainians don't have that capability. The Ukrainians do not have an air force. So if the Ukrainians are on the offensive, and if you acknowledge that inherently the person on the offensive is going to take more casualties, okay, now you can't look at maybe what happened during the Second Gulf War. Much different. The United States had a far superior military, and then obviously the largest, most capable Air Force on the planet Earth. So you have to remove that, but you have to look at this conflict within the context of this conflict. And the Ukrainians don't have an Air Force, or a very small one, that's able to launch incremental strikes against Russian targets. Whereas the Russians are able to sortie 100 airstrikes per day. Okay? And then compounding that, you have heavy artillery and other assets the Russians are using as well. So to say that the Russians are taking 7 to 8 times more casualties than the Ukrainians, while the Ukrainians are on the offensive, is really unreasonable. It just is. And any person who understands military operations would be very quick to say that's just not possible. That's out there. And then compounding that, again, you have to look at the terrain in which the Ukrainians are trying to launch this offensive. You have to look at the defensive operations that the Russians have been conducting, specifically these fortifications that have been put in place over the last several months. So very, very difficult for the Ukrainian military. So again, if we go back to this article, the Ukrainian military claimed on Thursday that its units had advanced towards 2 villages to the south and east of Robotyne. And then testimonies reviewed by CNN, yes, this is a CNN article, shed light on the numerous challenges for Ukrainian troops trying to break through a dense system of Russian minefields, anti-tank obstacles, and widespread tunnels in parts of southern and eastern Ukraine. So, again, has the Ukrainians broken through the main Russian defensive belt? Well, the answer to that is no. Are they near the main Russian defensive belt? Yes, they are. But this defensive belt is not just very long, running along the entire banana shape of this front line. It's also very deep, okay? Very deep. If you look from this sector here, this area of the maximum distance of Ukrainian advance to the end of the Russian defense in depth, the Russian defense in depth is as deep in terms of trenches and 3 layers of fortifications as is the salient that the Ukrainians have recently created. And then again, you cannot eliminate the fact that the Russians have an air force and are continuing to bombard the Ukrainians as they try to push south. Furthermore, near Kupiansk, now we have talked about this before, that the Russians were preparing for operations in this area. Now, what we are hearing now is that the Russians continue to strengthen its force construct in this area near Kupiansk. We believe now that running from Kupiansk south towards just north of Seversk in the area near Liman, the Russians have compiled, and that's this area here, the Russians have compiled a force of 150,000 personnel, 1,000 tanks, and several thousand armored infantry fighting vehicles, armored personnel carriers, and heavy artillery, including multiple launch rocket systems. So the Russians appear to be preparing for a major operation in this area near Kupiansk. It does appear the Russians are preparing the battlefield in this area to the east of Kupiansk. And again, if we look at the terrain, again, this is terrain that is optimum for Russian mechanized warfare. Will we see large maneuver units of the Russian military trying to exploit the Ukrainian operation in the south? Quite possibly. Again, the Russian buildup in this area is many times greater than the Ukrainian buildup in the Ukrainian offensive operation in the south. And that's just the way it is right now. Now, we have seen the Ukrainians start to use long-range weapon systems against targets deep inside of Russia. Over the past couple of days, we have seen both the Russians and the Ukrainians trade long-range cruise missiles, converted air defense systems, and long-range kamikaze drones against one another, which is escalating the conflict. We have seen the Ukrainians launch attacks against areas deep inside the Russian Federation, including as far north as Pskov in this area. And I believe the airbase that was hit was this locale right here. This is the headquartered area in which there is one of the best Russian VDV or airborne units located in this area. I believe it's the 76th Airborne Division that is based in this area and is operating as we speak in the ongoing Zaporizhzhia offensive. Now, we know that other targets have been hit inside the Russian Federation by Ukrainian missiles. Have they been successful, or have the Russians been able to shoot many of those drones and weapon systems down? We think it's both. We think the Ukrainians have been successful at times in hitting targets deep inside of Russia, and we think the Russians have also been successful in shooting some of those systems down. But some of those weapon systems have gotten through. The Russian air defense network is many times more robust than what the Ukrainians have. But at the same time, this conflict is escalating. And at what point are the Russians going to say, well, enough is enough? And what does enough is enough mean? Well, I think if the Ukrainians continue to strike targets deep inside of Russia and try to bring this war to the Russian populace, this is going to change the dynamic. This is going to change how the Russians view the end game of this conflict. At a certain point, the Russians, and more importantly, the Russian people, are going to say that Ukraine is an entity that can no longer exist. Then what? Then what happens? Again, as I talked about before, the Russian Federation, Russia, is not going anywhere. You have 140, 150 million Russians living in Russia. It's not going to change. Is the support from Western nation states going to change? Is the support from the United States going to change in terms of its direct support for the Ukrainian military? Is there going to be a new political leadership in the United States at some point, which is not going to adhere to the, let's just say it, some of the blackmail tactics that the Ukrainian state has on Joe Biden? Burisma. You cannot deny that the corruption allegations are ongoing and all roads lead to, yep, you guessed it, Ukraine. And the Biden administration is all in on Ukraine because it has to be. It has to be. I believe that the Ukrainian Security Service could release information about Hunter Biden's activities in Ukraine that would bring an end to the Biden government. And that's why we're seeing what we're seeing happen in terms of the direct participation by the United States in supporting Ukrainian forces. You can shape a narrative, and that's what's happening. So that's where we're at for today. We are continuing to watch the Ukrainian offensive. We are continuing to watch the buildup of Russian forces and continued Russian operations near Kupiansk. And we are continuing to watch the escalation in this conflict in terms of the use of long-range weapon systems against both sides as this conflict continues to escalate. We will have more very, very soon. As always, thank you for joining us. More to come. Have a good day.